Over the hazy skies of Wewak, New Guinea, a lone P-38 Lightning breaks formation. The pilot doesn't chase the enemy fighters climbing into the sun. He doesn't dive after the fleeing bombers skimming the jungle canopy. Instead, he circles, watching, counting, recording angles, altitudes, and attack patterns like a scientist observing lab specimens. His wingmen think he's lost his nerve. His squadron commander will demand answers when they land. But Captain Thomas McGuire has just discovered something no one else in the 5th Air Force seems to understand: that aerial combat isn't about courage or instinct. It's about mathematics, and he's about to prove it. The Southwest Pacific Theater in late 1943 is a crucible of attrition and frustration. American pilots flying out of Port Moresby, Dobodura, and Nadzab face an enemy that has been fighting in these skies for 2 years. The distances are brutal. Missions stretch across hundreds of miles of open ocean and impenetrable jungle. If your engine quits, if you take fire and can't make it back, the odds of rescue are slim. The odds of survival, slimmer still. The air war here is different from Europe. No massive bomber formations with fighter escorts stacked in tight defensive boxes. No clearly defined front lines. Instead, it's a war of interception and opportunity. Small groups of fighters sweep over enemy airfields, cargo ships, and troop concentrations. Engagements happen fast, violent, often at low altitude where there's no room for error. The heat is relentless. It seeps into cockpits, into flight suits, into the aluminum skin of every P-38, P-47, and P-40 operating from the crude airstrips hacked out of the jungle. Pilots sweat through their missions. They come back exhausted, dehydrated, sometimes delirious. Malaria and dysentery thin the ranks as efficiently as enemy gunfire. And the losses are mounting. By the autumn of 1943, the 5th Air Force has achieved air superiority in many sectors, but at a cost. Experienced pilots are being rotated home. Replacements arrive with fewer training hours, less gunnery practice, less understanding of the brutal physics that govern combat at 300 miles per hour. They're brave, eager, and they're dying. The problem isn't equipment. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its twin-engine reliability and heavy nose-mounted armament, is a formidable machine. It can outrun most opponents. It can outclimb them. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it's lethal. But skill takes time to develop. And time is something these young pilots don't have. The doctrine is straightforward. Engage the enemy, press the attack, support the bombers, protect the ground forces. But doctrine doesn't account for the chaos of a turning fight at 10,000 feet, where vision narrows, G-forces crush your chest, and the difference between life and death is a half-second decision made in a blur of adrenaline and fear. Most pilots rely on instinct. They react. They chase. They hope their reflexes are faster than the other man's. And sometimes, that's not enough. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. Thomas McGuire's death on January 7, 1945, sent a shockwave through the 5th Air Force. He had survived hundreds of combat missions, had shot down 38 enemy aircraft, had become one of the most respected tacticians in the Pacific. And he died trying to save a wingman who broke formation. There's a bitter irony in that. The man who had taught an entire generation of pilots to think before acting, to refuse bad odds, to never sacrifice position for emotion, he violated his own rules, not out of recklessness, not out of pride, but out of loyalty. In the months after his death, the story of what happened over Los Negros was told and retold. Some saw it as a tragic mistake. Others saw it as the ultimate expression of McGuire's philosophy, that mutual support wasn't just a tactic, it was a moral obligation. McGuire was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. The citation praised his aggressive spirit and exceptional skill. But those who knew him understood that his real contribution wasn't aggression. It was intellect, the ability to see combat not as chaos, but as a problem that could be solved. After the war, the Army Air Forces, and later the United States Air Force, began formalizing the tactical principles McGuire had developed in the jungles of New Guinea: energy management, mutual support, altitude discipline. These became foundational concepts in fighter pilot training. The training syllabus at Nellis Air Force Base, the Fighter Weapons School, and countless squadron ready rooms carried forward the lessons McGuire had written in his notebook and proven in the skies over the Pacific. He never wrote a manual. He never gave a formal lecture to a room full of staff officers, but his methods became doctrine because they worked, because they were logical, because they saved lives. McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey was named in his honor. A memorial stands in Sebring, Florida, where he spent his childhood, and in the fighter pilot community his name is still spoken with reverence, not as a legend, but as a teacher. He was not the highest-scoring ace. He was not the most naturally gifted pilot. But he was the one who proved that courage and intellect were not opposites, that study and aggression could coexist, that a man armed with a notebook and a slide rule could change the way an entire Air Force fought. In the end, Thomas McGuire's legacy is not measured in the aircraft he shot down, but in the pilots who came home because they learned to think the way he did, to see the sky not as an arena, but as a chessboard, to treat every engagement not as a test of nerve, but as a problem with a solution, and in that quiet, methodical approach to the most violent of human endeavors, he left a lesson that transcends the war itself: that the most powerful weapon a warrior can carry is not in his hands, it's in his mind. The problem facing American fighter pilots in the Southwest Pacific wasn't a lack of courage. It wasn't even a lack of training, though training could always be better. The problem was deeper, structural, almost invisible. It was this: most pilots fought the same way, every time. They climbed. They spotted the enemy. They dove. They fired. If they missed, they pulled up, turned hard, and tried again. If they were outnumbered, they fought anyway, trusting speed and firepower to see them through. If they were hit, they either made it home or they didn't. This approach worked often enough to be validated. Aces were made this way, victories were tallied, medals were awarded. But it also produced a steady, grinding attrition. For every successful engagement, there were close calls, damaged aircraft, wounded pilots, and, too often, empty bunks. The Fifth Air Force was winning the air war, but the cost in experienced pilots was beginning to show. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer flight hours than their predecessors. They were thrust into combat with minimal transition time. They learned by doing, or they didn't learn at all. And the lessons were harsh. The Japanese fighters they faced were flown by men who had been in combat since 1941, men who understood energy management, angle of attack, and the psychology of a turning fight. Men who could coax performance out of their aircraft that seemed to defy physics. American pilots had advantages: rugged aircraft, heavy armament, better radios, superior logistics. But in a close-in dogfight, those advantages evaporated. It came down to positioning, timing, and the ability to predict what your opponent would do next. Most pilots couldn't. They reacted, they followed, they hoped their speed or firepower would compensate for a bad angle or a mistimed turn. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. McGuire watched this pattern repeat itself mission after mission. He flew his first combat sorties in the summer of 1943, escorting bombers and strafing enemy positions along the northern coast of New Guinea. He was methodical, careful. He followed his element leader's instructions. He didn't take unnecessary risks, but he also didn't stop thinking. After every mission, while other pilots headed to the mess tent or collapsed in their cots, McGuire sat in his tent with a notebook. He sketched diagrams. He recorded altitude bands, attack angles, and response times. He noted what worked and what didn't. He asked questions that other pilots considered irrelevant. Why did the enemy break left instead of right? What was the optimal firing range for deflection shots? How much altitude could a P-38 trade for speed in a dive before it became unrecoverable? His squadron mates thought he was eccentric, obsessive. One pilot joked that McGuire treated aerial combat like a college exam. He did, because that's exactly what it was, a test with fatal consequences for failure. The insight came not in a flash of brilliance, but in the accumulation of small observations over weeks of combat. McGuire began to notice patterns. The way enemy fighters would attempt to lure American planes into turning fights at low altitude. The way they used vertical maneuvers to bleed speed from pursuers. The way they rarely committed to an attack unless they held a positional advantage. They weren't just reacting. They were setting traps. And American pilots, aggressive and confident, were walking into them. McGuire realized something fundamental. Aerial combat wasn't a series of random encounters. It was a sequence of decisions. Each decision created options or eliminated them. A pilot who understood the sequence, who could think 2 or 3 moves ahead, could dictate the terms of the engagement. It was chess at 300 miles per hour. He began to test his theories, not recklessly, but deliberately. He would position himself higher than the rest of his flight, sacrificing the immediate thrill of the first attack for a better overall position. He would refuse to chase damaged enemy aircraft if it meant losing altitude or separation from his wingman. He would break off engagements that looked favorable but were, in his calculation, traps. His squadron mates didn't understand. To them, it looked like hesitation, like overcaution. One pilot confronted him after a mission. McGuire had refused to pursue a lone enemy fighter that had peeled away from the main formation. The other pilot was furious. They'd had a kill, a confirmed victory, and McGuire had let it go. McGuire didn't argue. He explained, calmly, methodically. The enemy fighter had been drawing them down, away from the rest of the flight, toward lower altitude where additional enemy aircraft could be waiting. The risk outweighed the reward. The other pilot walked away unconvinced, but McGuire kept refining his system. He broke aerial combat down into principles. Energy management, speed and altitude were interchangeable currencies. Position, never engage without an advantage in angle or altitude. Patience. The best shot was the one you didn't have to force. Mutual support. 2 aircraft working together could dominate 4 aircraft operating independently. He began to share these ideas with the newer pilots in the squadron, not as lectures, but as quiet conversations over maintenance checks or pre-flight briefs. He drew diagrams in the dirt. He walked them through hypothetical scenarios. Some listened, others dismissed him as a theorist who thought too much. But the ones who listened started coming home more often. In late 1943, McGuire's methods began to crystallize into something like doctrine, not official, not written down in training manuals, but observable, repeatable, effective. He developed a tactical approach that would later be recognized as one of the most sophisticated fighter tactics of the Pacific War. He called it mutual support, but it was more than that. It was a complete reimagining of how 2 or 4 aircraft could operate as a coordinated system rather than a collection of individuals. The key was altitude and patience. Before engaging, McGuire's flights would climb higher than felt comfortable, higher than seemed necessary. They would position themselves above and behind the enemy formation. They would wait. Even if it meant watching other American flights dive into the attack first. Then, when the enemy was committed, when their attention was focused downward, when their energy was spent in defensive turns, McGuire's flight would strike. Not in a wild dive, but in a controlled descent, maintaining speed, maintaining separation. One pair would make the attack. The other would stay high, covering, ready to engage any enemy aircraft that tried to counterattack. After the pass, they wouldn't turn and fight. They would extend. Use their speed to climb back to altitude, reset, and, if the enemy pursued, repeat. It was disciplined, it was unglamorous, and it was devastatingly effective. On December 26, 1943, McGuire's flight intercepted a large formation of enemy aircraft over Cape Gloucester. Using his altitude and patience method, he led his element through a series of slashing attacks. He didn't chase, he didn't dogfight. He set up perfect firing passes, took his shots, and climbed away. He shot down 3 aircraft that day. His wingman got 2, and both returned without a scratch. The rest of the squadron noticed. By early 1944, McGuire had become an informal instructor. Pilots sought him out. They asked him to critique their tactics. They flew on his wing to watch how he set up attacks, how he managed energy, how he kept his cool when the sky filled with tracers. He was promoted to captain, then major. His kill count climbed steadily, 5, 10, 15. Not through reckless aggression, but through relentless, calculated precision. He flew with a notebook strapped to his leg. After every engagement, he would land, strip off his sweat-soaked flight suit, and write. He documented every decision, every mistake, every lesson. He reviewed gun camera footage, frame by frame, studying the geometry of his attacks. Other pilots shot down more aircraft in a single day. Other pilots had more raw talent. But no one in the 5th Air Force understood the mechanics of air combat as deeply as Thomas McGuire, and that understanding was saving lives. By the summer of 1944, the 475th Fighter Group had become one of the most effective units in the theater. Their loss rates were lower, their victory claims were higher, and their new pilots survived longer. It wasn't magic, it was study, discipline, and the stubborn belief that war could be understood. The impact of McGuire's methods rippled far beyond his own squadron. By mid-1944, his tactical principles were being taught informally across the 5th Air Force. Squadron commanders who had initially dismissed his cautious approach began adopting it. Flight leaders started briefing altitude discipline and mutual support as standard operating procedure. The results were measurable. Fighter groups that emphasized coordinated attacks and energy management reported fewer losses and higher victory ratios. Replacement pilots who learned McGuire's methods had better survival rates in their first 10 missions, the most dangerous window for any combat pilot. The 5th Air Force never issued an official tactical manual based on McGuire's ideas, but they didn't need to. His influence spread pilot to pilot, mission by mission. In the fluid, decentralized structure of Pacific air combat, this kind of organic tactical evolution was more effective than top-down directives. McGuire himself continued to fly and to fight. By the end of 1944, he was the second highest-scoring American ace in the Pacific, with 38 confirmed victories. Only Major Richard Bong, another 5th Air Force pilot, had more. But McGuire wasn't chasing a record. He was still studying, still refining, still teaching. On Christmas Day, 1944, he led a flight over Los Negros Island. The mission was a sweep: clear the skies, protect the bombers, deny the enemy any opportunity to strike American positions. It was the kind of mission he had flown 100 times. They encountered a small group of enemy fighters at low altitude. McGuire's flight had the advantage: altitude, position, numbers. It should have been a textbook engagement. But one of McGuire's wingmen was a newer pilot, aggressive, eager. He broke formation and dove after an enemy aircraft, committing too early, sacrificing altitude for speed. McGuire saw the trap. The enemy fighter was bait. There were others nearby, waiting. He radioed a warning, told his flight to hold position, to wait. But the young pilot was already committed, and McGuire, who had spent 2 years teaching others to fight smart, made a decision that defied everything he had learned. He dove after him, not to chase a kill, but to cover his wingman, to pull him out of a mistake that would get him killed. McGuire descended into the furball. Low altitude, high speed, enemy aircraft converging. He maneuvered hard, trying to position himself between the threat and his wingman. His P-38 was heavy with external fuel tanks, long-range tanks that should have been dropped before engaging. In the rush to protect his wingman, he hadn't jettisoned them. The added weight and drag changed the Lightning's flight characteristics, made it sluggish, unresponsive. McGuire entered a hard left turn, trying to bring his guns to bear. The aircraft stalled. At low altitude, with no airspeed to recover, the twin-boomed Lightning snap-rolled and plunged into the jungle below. He was 24 years old. Thomas McGuire's death on January 7, 1945, sent a shockwave through the 5th Air Force. He had survived hundreds of combat missions, had shot down 38 enemy aircraft, had become one of the most respected tacticians in the Pacific. And he died trying to save a wingman who broke formation. There's a bitter irony in that. The man who had taught an entire generation of pilots to think before acting, to refuse bad odds, to never sacrifice position for emotion, he violated his own rules, not out of recklessness, not out of pride, but out of loyalty. In the months after his death, the story of what happened over Los Negros was told and retold. Some saw it as a tragic mistake. Others saw it as the ultimate expression of McGuire's philosophy, that mutual support wasn't just a tactic, it was a moral obligation. McGuire was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. The citation praised his aggressive spirit and exceptional skill. But those who knew him understood that his real contribution wasn't aggression. It was intellect, the ability to see combat not as chaos, but as a problem that could be solved. After the war, the Army Air Forces, and later the United States Air Force, began formalizing the tactical principles McGuire had developed in the jungles of New Guinea: energy management, mutual support, altitude discipline. These became foundational concepts in fighter pilot training. The training syllabus at Nellis Air Force Base, the Fighter Weapons School, and countless squadron ready rooms carried forward the lessons McGuire had written in his notebook and proven in the skies over the Pacific. He never wrote a manual. He never gave a formal lecture to a room full of staff officers, but his methods became doctrine because they worked, because they were logical, because they saved lives. McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey was named in his honor. A memorial stands in Sebring, Florida, where he spent his childhood, and in the fighter pilot community his name is still spoken with reverence, not as a legend, but as a teacher. He was not the highest-scoring ace. He was not the most naturally gifted pilot. But he was the one who proved that courage and intellect were not opposites, that study and aggression could coexist, that a man armed with a notebook and a slide rule could change the way an entire Air Force fought. In the end, Thomas McGuire's legacy is not measured in the aircraft he shot down, but in the pilots who came home because they learned to think the way he did, to see the sky not as an arena but as a chessboard, to treat every engagement not as a test of nerve but as a problem with a solution, and in that quiet, methodical approach to the most violent of human endeavors, he left a lesson that transcends the war itself: that the most powerful weapon a warrior can carry is not in his hands, it's in his mind.